Welcome back my people to another Invincible video where today we are ranking every fight in the show so far. And I know you're probably wondering why you're seeing me in the intro if you've been watching my channel for a while, but I just felt like changing up for a bit, you know, I want to make more videos where I'm actually in them. But anyways, before we get into the ranking, we actually have to establish what is it that makes a good fight. Is it the animation, the stakes of the fight, the build up, the character expression? Like there's a lot of factors at play in ranking these fights. But you already know we're going to be doing this tier list style with S tier being the absolute best and F tier being reserved for the worst fights. Do I really think anything's going to end up in F tier? Probably not, but of course we have to keep it there anyways. And of course I'm not doing every fight in this video, that would take way too long and you don't have time for that and neither do I. But without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, the first fight I want to talk about is Omni-Man versus Mark. And I think all of you know what tier I'm going to be putting this in, but I want to rank it first because I believe this is a prime example of what a real S tier fight looks like. Firstly, the build up is perfect. So what had happened was Omni-Man had been battling with himself for so long on how to tell the truth to Mark now that Mark has his powers, and he really didn't want to screw it up, but because he was being investigated for the murders of the Guardians and knew that time was running out, he was forced into a position where he had no choice but to tell Mark after he beat the Immortal. And Mark is confused at what's going on, not being able to process everything. You know, he's just seen his dad murder one of the top heroes who's been dead for a long time, so from his perspective everything is just going wrong right now. But the second thing that really makes this fight stand out is the stakes of the fight, because when Mark decides to fight Omni-Man, it felt like the weight of the whole world was on his shoulders, so the stakes were seriously high, which makes this fight that much more engaging. And when they actually get to fighting, seeing Omni-Man absolutely outskill and destroy Mark in every aspect was just insane, because it's like, what now? There's nothing he can do to stop his father, which leads me on to the third factor making this an S tier fight, the ending. Because when Omni-Man is finished beating up Mark, his speech was not only iconic, but it led to a very satisfying conclusion, because when he asks Mark, what will you have after 500 years? Mark replies with, you dad, I'll still have you, which makes Omni-Man reflect on what he's really doing. And I've seen people criticize this ending saying it's not an ideal way to end a fight or it was unsatisfactory, but that is wrong, because it's clear that Omni-Man never really wanted to carry out this mission, but had been brainwashed and manipulated by Viltrum's ideology, so felt that he had no choice but to carry out his mission. And coming to Earth made him realize that life is more than just dominating those weaker than you or striving to be the strongest. So all around, this is an amazing fight. It's absolutely deserving of S tier, and it's probably my favorite fight in the whole series. So now that we've seen what really makes an S tier fight, it's easier to rank the other fights in comparison to what I believe is the gold standard. So next up, I want to take it to season 2 and discuss the Guardians versus the Lizard League. And the build up to the fight is pretty simple. So what had happened was some of the Guardians at the time needed to go to space to intercept a Martian ship full of Sequids, whilst the others stayed on Earth when all of a sudden the Lizard League attacked. And it was a pretty unexpected attack. You know, it seemed like it was just going to be a routine stop because the Lizard League aren't really a big threat, but for whatever reason they were actually a big threat on this day and actually overpowered the Guardians. And in a turn of events nobody saw coming, Duplicate died. Or well, we thought she did at the time, because of course it was revealed later that she was just hiding her real body somewhere else. So now this fight has become way more serious, and straight after this, Shrinking Ray gets crushed by this guy, and I'm thinking in this moment that she died too. So now it's on Rex to carry the fight on his own. Fortunately enough, he's able to kill the lizard girl in a 1v1 and then blow up the big guy, sacrificing his arm in the process. And while Rex is crying out in pain, King Lizard comes behind him and shoots him in the head. My guy literally cannot catch a break, but the goat Rex does not give up. So he got up and starts beating King Lizard so bad he looked unrecognizable. And I can't lie, this fight right here is goated. I guess the only part that I didn't really like was probably the build up. It was kind of mid, like the Lizard League did just randomly show up, but the stakes of the fight are immediately raised to a seriously high level when we see Duplicate die. And of course Rex carrying the fight solo was just so cold. Also, to add to this, when Rex lost his arm here, the voice acting really did sound real and raw, like the guy in the studio made it sound so authentic, and I just think that adds a nice little touch to the overall quality. So to be honest, I personally feel like this is deserving of an S tier. My only criticism is that retrospectively the stakes of the fight really weren't that high because nobody actually died, but still in the moment it did feel really intense, and while it isn't better than the season 1 finale, it's still really good and deserving of S tier, as this was definitely a standout from a not so amazing season. Now moving on to season 3, let's talk about Mark versus Angstrom, because with this episode there's a ton of fights we could talk about, but I think the most important one to talk about is the final fight in the episode. And build up wise, it wasn't that good, because what had happened was Mark and Eve fought 2 variants earlier and Eve got badly injured in the fight, so Mark stayed by her bedside until Cecil located where Angstrom was, and that's pretty much all the build up was for their encounter. And I know you could technically say there was more build up with what Angstrom had going on the whole time, you know, bringing out all the variants and stuff, and also the fact fact that this was going to be a rematch fight does kind of add to the anticipation, but overall I do kind of find the build up to be a bit lackluster. But anyways, Mark pulls up on Angstrom and they start fighting, and the fight was pretty good because it showed how much Angstrom prepared to take his revenge on Mark, and at the same time Mark showed how much he's improved in his skills because he's fighting way better, he's adapting quicker to Angstrom's attacks. It's a pretty good fight. It was quite short though, I think it was like 2.5 minutes altogether up until the point where he actually catches Angstrom, and when he does, that was probably the most tense scene of the fight because we're watching like, is he gonna kill him, is he not, because he's debating with himself like what he wants to do. But then it does end in a kind of anticlimactic way with Angstrom getting away by hitting Mark in the face with one of those cameras that he has, and somehow Mark just loses his grip on him all of a sudden and he just falls back slowly into the portal. Mark tries to rush and grab his arm, but it's too late, the portal's already shut, and now the only thing he's holding on to is Angstrom's arm. So overall, I'm not gonna lie, I feel like this fight was just alright. It wasn't anything special in my opinion. I feel like the actual fighting sequence was pretty good, but the build up and conclusion were not it. It's missing a lot of crucial elements that really make a fight stand out and be memorable. So in my opinion, this is a B tier fight, but like a low B tier, maybe even bordering C tier, I'm not gonna lie. But let's take it back to season 1 again with a fight that I think is really underrated. Rudy versus the Maulers. So what had happened here was Rudy was working with the Maulers to grow him a new body, but obviously because they're criminals, they had to keep it very hush hush. And of course, the Maulers were not just gonna work with the robot for free. So in exchange for growing Robot a new body, Rudy promised the Maulers the schematics for the GDA collar, which could be used to control anybody. So the day comes when the Maulers have finished Robot's new body, and Rudy pulls up on his own to collect it, and from the start it's a very intellectual back and forth between the Maulers and Rudy, which of course is very fitting for their characters as the geniuses of the series. And when the trade is complete, Rudy hands over the schematics and the deal is complete. But that is not where Rudy wants to leave things, because of course the Maulers are criminals and he knows that he needs to do his job as a superhero to lock these guys up. So he pulls out his supersized transformer robot and starts fighting the Maulers. But what I really like about this fight is how it plays into the intelligence of the characters, because the Maulers were literally building a weapon mid-fight to fight against this robot. Unfortunately though, the fight is cut short at the climax because Cecil calls the Guardians back to HQ. So even though the fight didn't have a true conclusion, I still found it to be really good. And of course, this fight definitely adds to Robot's depth as a character because it makes us question if Robot is really a good guy. Because why did he steal Rex's DNA? Why did he work with the Maulers? That's also something I enjoyed about this side plot with the Maulers and Rudy in general. So overall, I definitely think this is worthy of an A tier. But let's move back to season 2 with Mark versus Anissa. And as for the build up, I think it was pretty decent because the fight played into the relationship struggles of Amber versus Mark. So what had happened was Mark and Amber were finally able to go on a date after multiple interruptions and changed schedules, and their date was going really well when all of a sudden Anissa shows up and she's all like, come with me or I kill this girl. So the stakes of the fight were immediately raised. So Mark goes off with Anissa and she tries to convince him to do his duties on Earth. But you know how it goes with Mark, he's obviously not going to do them. So naturally Anissa tries to beat him into submission, and I'm not gonna lie, the fight itself was a bit boring because the initial stakes of the fight, that being Amber's life being in danger, had now faded away. So it kind of felt like we were just watching them fight for no reason, because we know that she's not gonna kill Mark. She even said she was trying to reason with him, and of course that became even more clear when she eventually gave up and just left. But I will say though, the climax of the fight is pretty good because even though she was standing on Mark's neck, he didn't fold and was like, if you're gonna kill me, kill me. So I respect that he was at least standing on business. But overall, I don't know, I feel like this fight kind of felt like filler, and technically it was the filler fight between what happened on Thraxa and what happens at the end of season 3, so I can see why it's not nearly as high stakes or engaging as the others. But in the wider context of some side plots, that being the struggles of Mark and Amber in their relationship, this fight was the plot device that broke them up. So in the wider context of things, this fight was kind of important. So while there are some good things about this fight, I do overall think it is kind of mid, so I guess I'm feeling like a B tier on this one. But lastly for this video, let's talk about Mark versus Powerplex, which I find to be a pretty good fight. So as I'm sure you guys know, Powerplex absolutely hates Mark because he blames him for what happened to his family during his fight with Omni-Man. And Powerplex has been holding a grudge on Mark for damn near 2 seasons at this point, so when he finally gets his chance to shine in episode 6, he wastes no time to try get Mark's attention so that he can fight him. But none of his attempts were really successful until he took some hostages, which were actually just his family, to bait Mark into a fight. So this fight definitely has some good build up, I must say. Now as for the actual fight, it was pretty good and there was much more talking than actual fighting, because Mark is trying to reason with Powerplex and explain like, yo, you don't have to do this, I get where you're coming from, I know why you feel this way, but Powerplex ain't trying to hear all that. And he's still trying to fight Mark, so Mark just punches him straight into a wall. But of course, Powerplex's ability allows him to charge energy from other people's punches and release it as electrical energy. And in the climax of the fight, this is exactly what he does. But of course, he ends up going overboard just a little bit and fries his whole family. But overall, I do think this was a really good fight. It had good build up, Powerplex has somewhat realistic motivations for doing what he's doing, and the conclusion is still very tragic because he became so consumed with rage that he disregarded the safety of his family, and that was the only people he had left in his life. So for someone who's technically a filler villain, I think this is pretty good and definitely deserving of an A tier. But that's pretty much it for this video. Let me know what fights you guys want to see in the next part very soon. I'm gonna try get it out for next week, but if I don't, I'm sorry, because it's actually really hard to make content across 2 channels and still being active in school. But speaking of my second channel, make sure you guys check it out if you watch anime and help me get to 1K subs. That's pretty much all from me, and I'll see you guys next time.